So this is our agenda for today. We're going to first hear a story from the Arab Spring, from Matt Perkins, who is with UN ESQA, and he will share with us some insights about that experience as kind of a framing conversation for our tutorial. Then you'll hear a little bit from me about the social media context, sort of more writ large, in terms of what we're seeing in terms of trends and realities, practicalities. And then finally, we're going to hear from Jana Hrdinova, who, as many of you may know, is the first author of a document that the Center for Technology and Government produced about a year ago. Gosh, that went by quickly, didn't it? Entitled 8 Essential Elements of Social Media Policy for Government. So it's very much focused on the governmental context, how government agencies can think about the creation of a social media policy to inform decision-making within those agencies. Our format is, as this says here, we're going to do some presentations, certainly, but we're also very much interested in discussion. So we're actually going to ask you to do some small group and some large group discussion over the next 2 hours, so that we can hear not only from us, but also from each other on some of these important ideas. Any questions for us before we start? Comments? Okay, good. So, Matt.
Good afternoon, everybody. We'll be talking today about social media and e-government applications in the ESQA region, which is in the Middle East. We have 13 member states going from Sudan to Turkey to Iran. So that's our geographical area. The specific focus of our inquiry today is going to be looking at the implementations of social media in the region to derive from a more people-driven perspective what individuals want to see coming from their governments in terms of social media. One of the problems that we have in dealing with this topic generally is that data is very spotty and oftentimes distorted in hidden ways. So to first understand what we do have in terms of measurements and insight, we have information on telephones, internet connectivity, literacy, basic ability to communicate numbers. We also have linguistic data that comes to us from Facebook and social media tools themselves. And we'll be looking at a series of studies that have been undertaken to dive into the social media resources online and map out how people are communicating with each other and what they want to say in the Arab world. Now, we have a couple of major blind spots that we need to illustrate before we go further. One of those major ones is YouTube. YouTube is extremely popular in the Middle Eastern region. It's one of the main drivers of content, and it's very, very difficult to measure. We get very poor statistics on who is sharing what with whom, where they are, and how that's spread. So we know we have a problem there. We typically have some large linguistic issues. There was some allusion to that in the opening session this morning, and we'll take a look at how that affects our insight. The other big one is the ripple effect. We're going to refer to this as proxy engagement. We know that in most of these countries we're dealing with a core of people who are well connected, and then ancillary communities that are more or less marginalized. This is a very interesting case study for us because within this small region, we have countries with comparatively low literacy rates, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% for Egypt, comparatively low IT penetration rates, 40-50% internet penetration, compared to countries just a little bit off to the side in the Gulf Coast, where we'll have literacy rates in the low 90s and communication rates that are well over 100%. So how those interplay are key. This is a visual depiction of some of the information that was discussed this morning in the opening session. Because the issues of penetration were discussed very well in the morning session, I'm not going to stay too long on this, but for anyone who was not able to attend that, what we have here is a more meaningful illustration of the capacity of social media tools to have penetration and impact in the host countries. Now, We talk a lot about the Arab Spring, and it's a convenient handle, but in some ways can be more confusing. The Arab Spring is often listed as the social media momentum, but in reality, when we look at the countries that are caught up in these kinds of political changes, the situations on the ground are so different, it's illusory to consider them all part of a single movement. For the purposes of our conversation today, the message of the Arab Spring that would be shared between all of the countries we're going to look at would be something more along the lines that leaders can fall, not along the lines of the impact of social media in the areas in question. Now, what this slide is illustrating for us is the Facebook subscriber numbers as a function of the population. Now, as we see in this case, Egypt is quite low, 22.61%. This is more illuminative. This has greater capacity to illuminate the question for us than typically some of the other indicators we see tossed around in terms of total Facebook subscriber numbers. For example, Egypt has one of the largest populations in the Middle East, so one would tend to expect a large number of Facebook users anyway. But as a percentage of the overall population, we can see that the percentage is quite low. One of the things that I wanted to illustrate is what we're seeing over here to the right of this graph, that we actually have quite a few countries where the percentage of Facebook use among the connected population is quite high. So when we talk about using this as a social media tool to communicate with the people who are connected, we have a stronger capacity in the left side of this graph than we do on the right. Okay. Yes? Mobile connectivity. We have quite a few cases where we have people who are using, we end up with more Facebook users than we have internet penetration, because the people are using Facebook on mobile devices that are not counted within the baseline connectivity statistics for the country. Accounts. Mm-hmm. Which is another footnote that would be well considered in this data, is it's certainly not unheard of for people to have more than one Facebook account. In fact, in certain demographics, people often have two or more. Any other questions? The issue of linguistics was raised in this morning's session, and it's a very good probative question for understanding impact in these areas. This graph illustrates the distribution of language settings among the Arab region countries. Now, some of this data is pretty consistent with expectations. When we look at the Egyptian case, for example, we see a pretty reasonable balance between Arabic and English. But this, again, is illustrative of the market that this tool is reaching tends to be more literate in English than the population as a whole. Particularly when we look at cases, for example, of Somalia and the United Arab Emirates, we might have a very well-connected population with very high Facebook use, but it's extremely unlikely that native Emiratis are choosing to use English on Facebook 85% of the time. These numbers are more suggestive that these Facebook subscribers are expatriate employed migrant workers in these areas. Particularly one that stood out to me in this regard was Yemen, and that will be an interesting case as we look further into the data. One component that has remained sadly under-discussed in our analysis so far is the capacity for social media to solve some of the gender empowerment problems that we have, particularly in developing countries. The Middle East is no exception in this regard. There's a wide diversity of levels of penetration in Facebook usage, and we'll need to sort of tuck this slide into the back of our minds as we start looking at some of the other social media usage patterns which follow different distributions. I have a lot of mixed feelings when I look at this slide because, for example, when we come back over at looking at our Yemeni Facebook users, which I think is a particularly interesting example of adoption of social media by the elite within the context of its capacity to influence others, With only 21% of Yemeni Facebook users being female, that's a very depressing number. However, I would advocate a more optimistic interpretation of this. If we were actually to establish an e-government empowerment program and attempt to set empowerment of women as a key deliverable, a 21% impact rate would be really good. So when we consider the capacity of this tool as it exists to reach a marginalized population, that's very good news. Obviously, we'd like to see that shift quite a bit, but as a place to start, there's certainly some room for hope in that regard. Lebanon, Bahrain, and Jordan, I like to point those out as being comparatively better balanced. This is my effort to win Most Confusing Infographic of the Session award. It's very information rich, and I enjoy it quite a bit, but it does bear some explanation, which is the sign of a bad graphic. This is derived from a data set that was put together by the Berkman Institute at Harvard University from a publication that they did called Mapping the Arabic Blogosphere. There's an intriguing amount of data that comes out of this. The images you see here, the size of the dot is derived by the number of other blogs which link to it, implying the impact and importance of that particular property. They're grouped by interlinking to one another and color-coded by topic. One of the things I'd like to point out here is that in support of what Thad Hall was saying this morning on the capacity of activist groups in the Middle East to effectively use social media to mobilize constituencies and push for change, we see a representation of the Muslim Brotherhood that is significantly higher than any other detectable special interest advocacy group in the Arabic blogosphere, and significantly stronger than pro-Islam categorized blogs in general. That being said, it's interesting to view this part of social media usage, being blogging, within the comparison to what we were seeing out of Facebook. In this case, we see the capacity to have outreach and impact transcending some of those national borders. These charts don't line up very well. When we look at the percentage of penetration that we have in Egypt, compared to their representation in the blogosphere, we see that they follow a very different pattern. This is a listing of the top visited websites from persons surfing from Egypt. It was derived from alexa.com for the month of August. One of the things that bears consideration here when we talk about using ICT for e-government outreach and these sorts of e-democracy and e-governance programs is to consider that we may have penetration rates which appear low, but the popularity of the tools themselves belie the amount of influence that those tools have in reaching their constituencies. If we look at this from a perspective as a government who's wanting to promote messages, services, philosophies to users, this shows us where the people are and what the people are doing. I think it's interesting to compare that by contrast to some of the social media adoption rates we've seen in the West, where blogging has been on decline, particularly in younger demographics in the last couple of years. That isn't holding true for the Middle East. We're seeing more perpetuation of blogging as a means of idea expression than we have in other cases. So I wanted to illustrate that. Here again, we have our YouTube problem highlighted. It was just the issue of mobile phone video and the impact that that's having on mobilizing political change. The communication of people in their home environments is again emphasized by this case. When these, the blogs that resulted in the infographic we saw earlier were analyzed, the most frequent outgoing link was to YouTube clips, and we see the ranking of the remainder. This helps us understand what people are talking about and how they're talking about it with each other. When bloggers in the Arab region talk about politics, this is how it tends to play out in the blogging social media phase. One of the things that stood out interestingly here was that domestic political reform as a topic of conversation at 17.5%. If you're a government that wants to reach out through e-democracy and have a bidirectional dialogue with the people, this is an excellent way to be able to facilitate communication with what people are talking about and how they want to see that pursued. It also reminds me of the adage in American politics to never screw up on a slow news day, with domestic news being one of the highest topics of conversation. This is a breakdown of the political themes discussed by bloggers in the Middle Eastern area. There are several interesting lessons that can be learned from this, but I wanted to highlight the areas of supporting and criticizing domestic leaders. There's a lot of engagement on these topics, and in ways that are sophisticated and idea-driven. When we see the the amount of time that connected populations are spending in tools like Facebook and Blogger, and the amount of political commentary that's happening through them, this helps us tap into the wishes of the people for engagement. When we look at how the people are interfacing between social media and their governmental representatives, we can see three clear cohorts of actors. The community at large, which in my case I would like to have include the non-connected population, people who are advocating for specific causes, and people who are trying to have redress for specific grievances. And I'd like to show you a few examples of how that's playing out. This is a success case in the city of Amman, Jordan. Omar Mani was the mayor of the city at that time. One of the things that I'd like to point out here is that even though we have a case where Twitter adoption is, as was illustrated this morning, quite low, we see in the interaction here multilinguality use. I know this was an important issue to some of the attendees in this room. And we have a bidirectional communication that is transparent to anyone who wishes to monitor this channel to see what's being asked for and how the government is responding directly to the people. This becomes kind of a digital open door policy that anyone can audit and see what's happening. I particularly chose this example because it amused me in light of one of our earlier sessions in which our folks from the UK were talking about the platform that they had made called Fix My Street. I think what we see here in this Twitter example emphasizes two important points. If you don't have an e-government application in place, social media will become the crack that engagement flows into. This turns it into the second point, which is this release valve for social pressure and governmental interaction. There's no application that they can go to and say, on my street, there's a problem with, in this case, wild dogs at night. But they can send a message to the mayor of the city, and he will respond to them, and anyone can see what happened. Here's another example of this case. I selected it because it helps illustrate engagement with the disaffected. In this case, the Twitter message was a little bit cranky. There's an overtone of concern about corruption in this case, and anyone, again, can see how the mayor dealt with that. I wanted to illustrate this because in one of the earlier sessions today, the 12 o'clock, and in some of our sessions previously, there's been a lot of conversation about trust. And particularly in the Arab region, there are a lot of concerns about people trusting their relationships with government, the competence of the government. Does the government want to listen to me? Are they going to do anything about it when they do? I've noticed from a lot of the folks who have been doing e-government applications in the developed world that the message has been, you have to have infrastructure first, and the e-government is only as good as the physical government, the brick and mortar government. I would like to suggest that in the developing world, we have a little bit of a different situation. Even though in, for example, the Lebanese case, there are quite a few areas of the country where they'll be quite happy to have 8 hours of power supplied a day. That would be a good day. But we have internet penetration rates and mobile penetration rates sufficient that people can interact and do interact quite a bit in Facebook and blogging, as we saw in the infographic earlier. So even in cases where the infrastructure is quite poor, interaction is still enabled. In cases where trust in government is quite low, we can use social media applications as an opportunity to have transparent accountability to the people. Why would we not want to do that? I'd like to now branch off a little bit to talk more about this trust factor. There were two studies that really caught my attention, and this also speaks to some of our cross-cultural blind spots that I alluded to earlier. They were done by Pew, the Center for Research in American Public Life. In this case, they did a study in 2009 that was seeking to address why the discussion networks in the American social sphere were shrinking. People had less friends and they talked to them less. They wanted to know what was going on with that. And so they specifically studied whether or not IT was having an impact on that. And there were some intriguing findings from that data. I would encourage anyone who's interested to review the study in a whole, but I pulled out these particular factoids to illustrate a correlation that is a rich opportunity for further study. If it offers a causative effect, it'll be great. When people are using the internet, and particularly social media, this correlates with different trust mechanisms. In this case, broader social networks, the probability of having a confidant who is of a different race, exposure to different ideas, and in the case of Facebook, higher political engagement. A second study that I would cite us to by this title was just released in 2011, also illustrated some intriguing findings correlated specifically to users who were more engaged on Facebook, controlling for factors such as income, education, gender, and so forth. And what we see from this is that all other things being equal, controlled for, Facebook use highly correlates to political activity. If this effect holds true cross-culturally, we have a unique opportunity to influence social change by engaging with social media in this region. Final point that I'd like to pull out of this is this quote to substantiate the political activity issue. This is an example of the second cohort. We've moved now beyond the public in general to address advocacy groups. This is an initiative from a very impressive young lady, Ezra Al-Shafai. She's from Bahrain and has been very successful in putting together social media advocacy groups for a wide variety of topics through the Middle Eastern region. And has been arguably quite successful in driving for change off of those. This being an example of e-democracy and civic engagement in these platforms. Finally, I'd like to highlight the example of the petitioner, in this case on the Bahrain e-government web property. One of the things that I'd like to highlight about this is that typically in the social media e-government interactions we're seeing in the Middle East, governments are still using social media as though it was another broadcast channel, a tool to inform people. It's sort of a enough about me, what do you think of me kind of idea. In this case, the material being put out by the government very much falls into that grain. They're basically press releases. However, we do see more interactivity in the comments. In this particular case, a specific suggestion was made, and the government came back and responded and took the required action, the recommended action. I'd also like to illustrate this. The e-government portal poses specific questions to the visitors, collects the data, and I thought of particular note, illustrates the action that has been taken as a result of the information provided. Certainly a far step from e-voting, but in terms of a government consulting with and being accountable to its people, it's a great step in the right direction. In terms of understanding the glass half full question that I raised in the meeting this morning, I think we've covered the notion quite robustly that none of us, or at least none of us willing to speak in public, are under the impression that these were Facebook revolutions. And it is important to understand that there are specific limitations to the social media interactions in the public sphere. However, this data coming from the data set that Pipa was referring to earlier this morning from the Dubai School, this is the Arabic Social Media Report, 2nd edition. did research on Facebook, among Facebook users in the Middle East, and when this represents the results of the data that they obtained there, it's very clear that among people who are using social media, they very much want their politicians to continue to engage directly with them in social media. So returning to our opening question, how do people in the Arab world want their governments to engage with them? We have 3 main points. Governments need to first understand the online ecosystem, how the people are talking to each other, who's driving what. In some cases, are we dealing with very low penetration where we're focusing on how am I reaching the next person, not just the person on the other end of the social media screen? And design these engagements specifically in mind for reaching those who are underserved. We had an earlier question in the conference this week on, are we not talking about applications in developing worlds that are essentially already reaching the elite and the connected? This is an important point. We've talked about the knock-on effect quite a bit, so I'll save that for now. But it should be part of any active social media policy. And then the third bullet point, I would advocate that particularly in the developing world, where these social media engagement points are not displacing existing e-government applications. There aren't other ways for the people to interact with their leaders. These tools themselves can rightly be considered part of the e-government strategy. An active campaign to engage proactively on Facebook, engaging with influential members of the blogging community to drive policy and show accountability and communication are excellent opportunities for these e-government engagement policies. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. On approval from Theresa, we'll go ahead and open open the program to direct questions on this presentation at this point, and then we'll get going with the rest later on. Please.
Thanks. Could you make some comments about the difference or relationship or impact of social media relationships between people within a country and those in country and out of country, and particularly in the context of the Arab Spring? I mean, there was a statistic that I've seen that 50% of the tweets in the Arab Spring basically were in English because of an engagement of the global audience.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great point. I'm trying to madly click my back button to get back to the infographic of doom. Maybe that's a fool's errand. Twitter is a really interesting case, and not to be too academic about it, but going back to the defining the terms, I think there's a tendency to view the Egyptian revolution as the Arab Spring, and certainly the fall of Mubarak was sort of a keynote event in that process. But I think we need to understand have the notion of the Arab Spring be broader than that. Now, in that case, there was a lot of Twitter engagement in English. Citing the Arab Social Media Report volume as well, they did some really intriguing research going back and mapping calls for action, specific calls for action and demonstration, both on Facebook and Twitter, with the resulting action which occurred to show whether or not there was any correlation in these tools driving activity. Particularly in the case of Twitter, the correlation is pretty slim. I would advocate that was, particularly in the Egyptian case, more of a taking the local events to the international stage than it was for the coordination of events within the country. Data that I think would back that up very well is that it's important for us to keep in mind that for an entire week during the Egyptian revolution, the internet was completely non-functional in the country. And this didn't correlate at all to the number of people that were going out in the street. And I would supplement what Thad said earlier about the social media used by the Muslim Brotherhood to promote political change. When the Mubarak regime made the decision to pull the plug on communications, this had an encircling effect around the middle class that was watching the revolution play out at home, and they felt this as the regime defining them as part of the revolution because they were now affected. The government cut off my phone. I'm part of this too. So I think in many cases, the absence of ICTs in a broader scale had much more to do with getting people in the streets in the Egyptian context than anything else. As a counterpoint to that, I think some of the things we're seeing in political changes that are currently happening in the Arab world, the engagement between what's happening on the ground and what the international community is paying attention to has been absolutely vital when we look at cases like Yemen and Syria and how the international diplomacy is coming in and what's going in and out of the country is a really key point. And I think in those cases, SMS in particularly, cell phone video, is having much more of an impact. And to the degree that we can conflate SMS and Twitter as a communication platform, I think that would be an easier sell.
Silver from Estonia. I have two questions. First, you presented a survey that was saying something like people using Facebook daily or twice a daily are more likely to say yes to the question that most people can be trusted.
Yes.
Have you ever thought about the possibility that that is vice versa, that these people who trust people are more ready to use Facebook, put up their picture of their children and talk about the things? So it's not the result, but the starting point, that when you start to use Facebook, you have to trust people. And the second question is about the research about the Facebook. How many people use Facebook? I just checked the statistics, and I have to say that just in recent 2 or 3 months, China just passed Estonia, where there are more than 500,000 Facebook users in China and only 400,000 in Estonia. Although in China it's 0.04%, and in Estonia it's 33% of population using Facebook. And my question is there any research that will also look to other social network tools than Facebook but are local? Like in China we have Ren, for example, and then we can really say how many people are connected via social network. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Now I'll go ahead and take those, and then we'll get over to the left half of the room. So your first point on is Facebook causational. I was trying to be deliberate in my wording on that this is a correlation. As an IT guy, I would love the notion that an IT tool is driving humans to behave differently. That's a pretty hard sell. That's very rarely true. However, when we're looking at markets particularly like the United States, which does have a comparatively very large percentage of the population on Facebook, I would hypothesize that it probably isn't exclusively an effect of trusting people gravitate towards Facebook. If that's the case, we had an enormous amount of very trusting people lying around the room in the United States just waiting to coalesce. I would kind of guess that's not so much the case. Some of the other tools that were looked at in the Pew research, there were MySpace, image sharing, and blogging. There were some very intriguing differences in how trusting people are depending on which tool they tend to use most. One of the things that's really interesting to me is that when you break down issues of privacy and trust online and then sort them by generational cohort, younger people care a lot less about privacy issues than older people online. Why that is a fascinating question. But I would hypothesize that as people use tools that make it easier to connect with other people, they become less concerned about doing so, and that enables them to make these kinds of connections more freely. And I think in laying, we talk a lot about, is the Middle East ready for democracy? Is XYZ developing country ready for democracy? These issues of civic trust and capacity to engage with people who are not similar to yourself are key. And so if we have an issue here where tools which enable sharing help people feel more comfortable sharing and discussing things with people different than themselves, that's red letter news. I mean, as policymakers, we really need to look into that to understand how that's going to affect our populations. But you asked a second question. On the Chinese example, I think conflating Facebook users across China and Estonia would probably be a tough sell. In the linguistic issue there, as I've seen the data, there are vastly more Chinese users using other social media tools than Facebook. The comparative adoption rates between the tools there are disparate, so I wouldn't want to conflate tools. But I think we're going to have some great research coming out on the behavior side there, looking at that shortly. Do you want to go ahead?
I think
or?
we actually have some folks studying the
Yep.
China context, right? Who would like, maybe could
We'd
weigh
be
in.
delighted. Could we get a microphone here?
Do we have a mic?
Yeah, we just very much agree that professor's comment, and that's.
Lei, can you identify yourself for me?
Okay, I'm Lei Zhen from Fudan University, and actually in the last 1 year we are studying social media in China, how government in China using social media to communicate with citizens, and
Awesome.
particularly we look at a Chinese version of Twitter, because Twitter and Facebook are actually blocked by Chinese government, but it doesn't mean that Chinese people don't have social media. For example, we have in this past year there was a social phenomenon in China we call the Weibo phenomenon. Weibo is a Chinese Twitter, and it's users reach 200 million in just 1 year, and the whole country, everybody is using their smartphone, criticizing government, talk about public issues with Weibo. So if you only look at Twitter, how many Twitter users in China, that's not a good methodology. But if you need to look at Chinese social, the Chinese social media, we have a Chinese version of Facebook, Twitter, all those like Ren, QQ Zone is very popular, and Weibo is also.
Yeah, I really wonder about
600
the perspective. When we're talking about developing countries that don't already have an e-government engagement platform, why would we recommend that you go build your own tool and try to get people who are already somewhere else networking quite effectively to come over to you? Why do you not go to where the people are and engage with them? So I think that's
exactly our recommendation to the Chinese government. So because the 200 million, the Weibo, the Twitter has been very popular, and I think just half a year ago I received a phone call from Beijing from Shane from SIC,
okay.
and he asked me opinion about the Weibo, because some governments are talking about they also want to use the Weibo, the Chinese Twitter.
Awesome.
But some Chinese government agencies have very interesting ideas. He said, why not we open our own platform on our website? So I said, wow, that's totally against the social media idea. If you have your the platform, the Weibo platform, then people don't come because they already have a community there with 200 million people. So you should join that bigger community rather than create your own community. That's like build your own website. So that's the idea we talk about.
one of the things that I find intriguing about this question is the notion of why when we have governments building e-government portals, I'm not hearing people say, I'm from country X and I'm really losing confidence in my government because they don't have an e-government portal for me. And well, I'm from country Y and we do have an e-government portal, so I feel great and I have trust. But when we have governments which are willing and interested in engaging, that's the key point. And so for a government that wants to solve that problem, what's the better tool to use? Building an e-government portal or using pre-existing social networking tools to engage with
And
people?
I would suggest it's the latter one, is to join a social media platform, to open an account on Weibo, on this 200 million platform, rather than building your own portal or own application, whether it's your own Chinese government version of Facebook or Twitter. So that's
if you're a developing country and you have high Facebook uptake among your population and limited resources, from the glass half full perspective, instead of sitting around and complaining about how low penetration is, why don't you use the penetration you have to maximal effectiveness? Anyway, we've got at least 2 questions, and Jana is probably sharpening her axe for my head. So let's.
Since we're talking about the around the background of the Arab Spring,
Yes.
Among the parameters that you used in your slides, they are all extremely good, except that one parameter is missing, specifically the age group of the users of the Facebook. This is one aspect of it. And the second aspect, particularly in the case of Syria, there is a large use by the government against the users of on Facebook? And is there a way of finding out first the age group of the users and differentiate between the sort of, let's say, social activists as opposed to people who are driven by the governments to derail whatever is happening?
So the first answer is yes. Theresa will probably not believe this, but I actually cut those slides to save time, having taken now almost double my time. But that data does exist. It roughly maps to the demographic trends already seen. We have very high uptake among the youth, typically lower uptake among people older than 35. I think again, the glass half full message there is it's a great way to engage with the people who are most likely to be politically active and influenceable. If you'd like, I'd be happy to send that research to you. It's certainly there. In terms of governments using social media for nefarious purposes, I think the broader question goes back to what kind of government are we dealing with? Is this a government that wants to have positive interaction with its people? If so, this is a great tool to do that. We shouldn't have the tool driving the discourse. The discourse here needs to be about engaged, human rights-oriented government. And this is a great tool for that. It can also be very effective for less pleasant purposes.
You had one more question?
I'm really eager to hear what your question is. Please. Yeah, you.
Worried you're running out of time. But no, my question is, maybe it's a bit crazy, but I think it's important. I heard in the context of Egypt and other places that when the governments closed down the networks, there was an incipient and a fast developing hacker community that started developing alternative social media tools using alternative channels, which I don't understand how they did it because I'm not in that. But how important do you think that is? Do you have any evidence for that? Because I think that's quite interesting in relation to a much more bottom-up models. You know, these tools, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, they're basically all tools provided and which people can come and use. Fine, you know. But there seems to me also some developments happening which people are, in the face of restrictions, starting to develop their own tools. I wonder if you have any evidence for that.
There is some good data to look at. We could probably have a whole session on just that, but I believe one of the specific implementations that would fit the case you're raising is when phone lines were made available for people to be able to call in and have their message transcribed as a tweet that would then be broadcasted. Google was active in trying to implement that. When we look at the timeline of when those sort of tools were deployed and what the Twitter hashtag trends were at the time and overlay that on how many people were showing up where doing what, I don't see a correlation. I really don't think that at that stage of what was happening that Twitter was relevant on the mass level. You know, at that point we were already talking about millions of people taking action. I was intrigued with what people was displaying earlier about how when people are using the internet for a primary news source as a baseline, their views change differently. But I think, you know, once the tires have started burning, how much is that kind of Twitter hacktivism helping? I think that's a tough sell.
Great. So we hopefully will be able to get back to some more discussion as quickly as possible. But we also, in this conversation today, want to... Thank
you. I felt so nervous.
Let's make sure that there. Want to have, as part of the conversation, I think the points that Matt rightly raised in his final conclusions, the conversation that's also occurring about social media as a service delivery platform. And so we have, through the kind of use that we're seeing throughout the world in terms of social media, we're having increasing questions within government about how to reach that community of citizens who is, in fact, all over the world spending time on these tools. How do we reach them to deliver core government services? And I think that, we've seen lots of these, the numbers, every social media presentation anymore has to spend a little bit of time on the numbers, talking about things like Facebook and awareness of how 100% awareness of Facebook as an example. And I think this, maps back to the other conversation that was happening earlier about the actual tools, and how do we understand what are the tools that are being used around the world in the different regions of the world. What does that tell us? I think it tells us some interesting things about penetration of specific tools, but it also tells us pretty quickly who's talking with whom and who is not talking across the boundaries of government or of country borders. This is a kind of an insular conversations happening in some of these places on these country-specific tools. It raises a whole new level of research potentially for those of you in the room like me who are very interested in the creation of interoperable systems. So how might we begin to think about connecting up some of these networks? But I think this diagram tells a really important picture in my mind in terms of the sort of the practical realities of take-up of different kinds of tools. These are some numbers that actually respond back to some of the things that were asked earlier about, what do we know about those numbers? 200 million people, 677 million people. Well, what do we know about those numbers in particular? Can we learn something from them in terms of the ages or the profile of these users? And I think this is an interesting thing when we're talking about the social engagement process, certainly. Who's out there expressing opinions? And that's a really very, very critical part of the conversation. But it's also a very critical part of the conversation when we think about social media potentially as a service delivery platform. And so in particular, I like the number 96% of the US millennials have joined a social network site. One of the projects that came to my attention in the state of New York was a project, and it in fact frames some of our conversation today about the use of social media in terms of delivering services to citizens, is that, so with a number like that, 96% of the US millennials have joined a social network site. It's a good number. The challenge we have inside many of our government agencies is figuring out what to do with that number. So I was approached by the Office of Children and Family Services in the state of New York, who has a program focused on youth at risk. And they began to understand that if they want to engage these young people, make sure that they take advantage of the services that are available through the Office of Children and Family Services, that they need to connect with them in a non-traditional way. Well, non-traditional to whom? Non-traditional to the agency, the public workers in the agency, but not non-traditional to those individuals who fall into the category of youth at risk. And so that agency, that team began to figure out, okay, so how do we reach out to these people? How do we engage them? And they began to work in their government agency and realize that there was no policy framework within which they could put some of their programs and services on a social media platform. They did not have the legal authority to enter into an agreement as an individual government employee. So they couldn't check the box that says, I agree to the terms and conditions on behalf of my agency to live up to these terms and conditions. So what did they do? They did it at home. So they began to set up services using social media sites outside the legal platform that would be provided, or the legal, the foundation that would be possible if in fact their agency had a set of policies and procedures for the use of social media as a service delivery platform. And we as an organization at CTG began to understand there are two parts of this conversation, at least, in terms of social media and how we engage or leverage the potential of social media to make a difference. Certainly there's the conversations that we're all having, as Matt pointed out, the engagement, the awareness, the community building, the revolution, if you will. But there's also potentially a revolution in service delivery, but we have to think about it in a different way. So again, these kind of changing behavior patterns need to be taken into account. So just as I end up using a few stories from my own perspective, just as I began to learn how to text with my daughter, she now says, "Oh no, Mom, I don't text anymore. I Facebook message." I'm like, huh, okay. So, no, I don't. I said, "Oh, did you text Nicole today?" Right? She's a new college freshman, so she's keeping up with her friends. "Did you text Nicole?" "Oh no, we don't text anymore. We Facebook message." Oh, okay. Well, I didn't talk to her for a week. Her behavior's changed. So, but this is a good thing. This is an exciting thing. The challenge as government managers around the world is how do we take into account these rapidly changing behavior patterns among the communities of people that we're trying to serve with programs that change slowly. They're service programs taking advantage of the services that government has to offer. And so we have to take that into account. The kind of growth, of course, we've talked lots about, and that just, I think, does two things. It raises even more significantly the opportunity that we have, but it also, I think, increases the imperative that we figure this out and we put policies and procedures in place inside of government to make sure that we can leverage this potential. So, using another example, or, this kind of, citizen preferences, we look at all this take-up data. 100 million people, 40 million people, 600 million people. But what we also have are some trends in preferences. Social media, do we have a pointer here? Oh, wrong one. Okay, social media, this is so cool. I'm going to set up a profile and see who else is connected. I can even update my status from my cell phone. I am so connected, right? I'm on Facebook, MySpace, Twitter, LinkedIn. This is really cool, and I have a lot of connected friends. Okay, then we, sort of the beginning into the trough of disillusionment for those of you who know this, right? Okay, there isn't one app that can update all the social media sites. I'm going to start deleting my friends that I don't want to stay in contact with and that don't answer my tweets. I don't need to be on all the social media sites. I think I'll stick to Twitter and delete the others. So the preferences are starting to play out. We're beginning to make choices. Twitter is cool, but I don't want people knowing what I'm doing all the time. Well, this is also about how we used to use Twitter. When Twitter first came out, right? When was the last time you saw a person send a tweet that said, "Stepped across the room, going for coffee"? We don't do that. People don't use it like that anymore, do they? Do they? Does anybody in here use it? Apologize. But we're sort of developing our usage patterns, the way we think about and use these tools. I have my son graduated from college about 3 or 4 months after he graduated from college, and he had about 900 friends on Facebook because, everybody you meet at a party, friends you, blah, blah, blah. He said, "Mom, I'm going to start deleting friends." I said, "Do you think that's okay?" I said, "What happens when people delete friends?" I said, I don't know. This is new territory for me. He's asking me, right? He deleted about 300 people who had friended him and he had accepted, and I'm sure people were doing the same. But he got to the point in his personal experience that he began to understand, okay, all right, enough's enough. This is really about who I want to be in contact with. And as a college student, the more the merrier. As a young professional, he had a very different perspective. And he said, I don't want to clutter my life with all of these friends. I want to unclutter my life. I want to focus on the relationships that matter to me. And I hope these people aren't offended as I defriend them. But defriending was a very serious process for him. He had to think about it. What did it mean? What might the impact be? So that kind of takes us back into this kind of social space. But as we begin to think about social media and the transitions that we're seeing in our own use and our own understanding and the use of those around us, we see it being used in very specific ways by different kinds of communities. The civil society, using it, of course, to influence government actions and policies. We've seen that a lot. Used by government figures, as Matt said, as a new channel for the PR office, for the PIO, the Public Information Officer. Right? So the question is, okay, did you print out the press release? Did you email the press office? Did you tweet? Okay, yep, check, check, check. We're also seeing governments, in more like my friend at the Office of Children and Family Services, to actually communicate to governments, or to citizens, to engage with them. So not the political leaders, but government managers who are asking for feedback about programs and services. So there's the use of government figures. We know a lot about that. But there's also the use of government managers. A criteria for success in many of the e-government or e-governance award programs that I see around the world for programs that are put in place by government managers is how are you communicating with citizens to get feedback on your program? This is not, what do you think about my politics? What do you think about my platform? It's what do you think about my service? Did I do a good job issuing you a license? So we're starting to see government managers think about social media and how they engage this way. And now they're beginning to think, how do I use it to deliver a very concrete service? So one of my last slides before I hand the podium to Jana is some of the trends, and I have to bring it back to a US experience, where we see on the left here, as of July 2010, we identified that 22 of 24 major federal agencies had a presence on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm usually a fan of saying things like, okay, so what? Right? So they have a presence, okay? I have a presence too, but I'm not actually doing anything, right? But then we also look at things like back in 2010, NASCIO, the National Association of State Chief Information Officers in the US, did a quick study of CIOs, and they asked them to characterize the current status or implementation of social media initiatives in your state. 23.3 of them were full speed ahead. 48 were proceed with caution. Proceed with caution. So what do you think they're being cautious about? That's actually a question. What do you think they're being cautious about in the states? Are other governments being cautious about implementing the implementation of social media initiatives? Why are they being cautious? Anybody?
Maybe some information which is not ethical to publish, some possibility to threat or to make some problem to the authority.
Okay, so they're not sure if what they're going to do, what they're considering doing is problematic.
And whether they will be up to the expectations of the public also.
Right, so is there a quality, what are the new criteria for quality control, right? Do most government agencies have in place quality control criteria for outreach over social media platforms, for delivery of service over social media platforms? I would imagine not. This is new territory. How much? No, social media is free. I know, what is the TCO of a social media-based government service delivery program? Does anybody know the answer to this question? It's a very exciting problem to have, to think about how do we actually change a service delivery strategy when we think about social media. What are the questions that we have to ask? And a lot of what you're going to hear about from Jana when I get off are what are the policy questions that have to be answered? What are the policy elements that need to be addressed before a government agency, my friend Joel, can say, you know what, we're going to put in place a youth at risk program for our agency that is not actually run out of my house. It's actually going to be an official service provided by the agency. It's not that easy to do, it turns out. So I just want to add, before I step down, a set of recommendations that I think are very useful here, as we are all extremely euphoric, I think, optimistic about the potential here, about the opportunities. But based on conversations that happened at a workshop that I participated in Geneva in the spring, there was a set of recommendations that were put on the table by that group, and I think they're useful here. And one of them is, frankly, pay attention to what we've already learned. When we move into the service delivery environment from a social media platform, we need to understand how the lessons that we've learned over the years are relevant in this context, because many of them are. We cannot throw them all out. We need to adapt them in this context and see which ones can, in fact, help us leapfrog into a new service delivery opportunity. The second one was actually a recommendation that came from the presentation of the Bahrain experience, where in fact there was interest in social media as a platform for connecting officials to citizens, and the proposal was to actually put a top minister in front of a device and encourage them to start engaging with citizens. And no surprise, the whole cabinet said, well, in the US they would have said, are you crazy? I don't know what the comparable phrase is in Bahrain, but needless to say, they didn't do it. But one person did. And one person did it with a lot of help and a lot of support, and pretty soon everybody was doing it. Right? So they started small, they created comfort, and then they moved forward. And I think this is going to be the same kind of a strategy when we think about service delivery in programs that make sense, like Youth at Risk. But what about using a social media platform to deliver application services for the elderly? Don't forget the digital divide still exists. I think Matt talked about the engagement potentially of the elites in conversations, but we also have to think about the non-elites, and I'm sure that Matt was thinking of those folks as well. How do we make sure that we're reaching out in all places? And finally, this as we think about Gov 2.0 as a technological trend, which opens up this kind of new kind of e-governance for us. We need to think about how to create this space that's appropriate for an information society. So the challenge is we have sort of mainstream, long-standing government service delivery processes. We have a new technology opportunity that can change those, and we need to think about how to put these things together in a way that catapults us to an information society, doesn't keep us in this very sort of industrial engineering kind of a space when we think about service delivery, which is really sort of the foundation of government services our government is in terms of the services we deliver, and that the services we deliver are based, I think, on the way that citizens can inform us about what they want and how they want us to deliver those services. So for my part, I want to introduce Jana Hrdinova, who is a member, as you know, of the Center for Technology and Government staff, and who was the project lead on CTG's exploratory social media project.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to the session. A quick disclosure, I was supposed to have 85 minutes. I now have 50, so I am obviously going to run out of time, but I'm going to try to go through my slides as quickly as possible, and at the same time, hopefully, allow you time to ask questions. So we started this project in the summer of 2009. It lasted about 2 years, but as some of you know in the room, projects in CTG never die. It is still alive and still going. It consisted of several workshops with government officials from New York State, as well as local and federal governments around the United States. And we only collected data in the United States. This is a quick disclosure. In the United States, as Theresa has shown on a previous slide, governments have been active in social media quite a bit, and therefore we were interested in how do they see social media, what do they see the benefits to be, and also, what are the barriers to them using social medias? Because even though the percentages are quite high, there's still a lot of local and state government agencies who are very reluctant to jump in. And then we also asked them about the overall strategy and planning, and then based on a question that we sent out, which was asking for policies of government agencies that were existing. And I sent it out to my network, which is fairly big, and I got probably 10 emails back saying, we don't have a policy, but we really want one. So when you're done with all you're doing, please send it to us so we can actually create a policy, because as many people have mentioned, for government, governments are bureaucracies. There is no way to get around it. So for them to just jump in without any type of framework or policy structure, it is very scary, especially, for the lowly government manager who can get canned anytime if his boss decides that he doesn't like him anymore. So these were the perceptions that we collected from the field in the United States, the benefits of using social media. Obviously, reaching new audiences, the need to reach out to the youth, was seen as a huge benefit. The potential to connect with those people who normally don't really want to communicate with government that much because government isn't cool. You also have more control. We talked to some of the local government agencies, and they said, when the Times Union, which is the local paper in Albany, writes about me, it's never good. It's always, the most embarrassing possible story. Facebook and Twitter gives me an opportunity to present the good side of what I'm doing, and that is very important to them as well. It also has the potential to enhance your collaboration with your stakeholders, and also reducing routine questions from the general public, which cuts down on your cost of providing these services. They also felt that it would improve public perception of them, that we are cool and we are advanced and we are using what you're using, which I don't know if how many of you know, but in the United States that is not the perception of government. Government is seen as the backward elephant in the room sometimes. And also cost savings. As many of you know and have experienced in your own countries, we are going through financial crisis right now, and state government are very, very much affected by this. So they are looking for ways to still get their message out, but at the same time cut on the cost of doing so. When we mapped it against the research or against the survey done by NASIO, it mapped up very, very nicely. As you can see, citizen engagement was one of the most important reasons why state governments have gone on social media, as well as public information and outreach, as well as business engagement and government engagement with other agencies. At the same time, we also know, and these statistics have been already mentioned in the morning session, that we have this perception of citizens wanting to engage with us, and if we are on social media and Facebook, we are going to be connected. But when you actually look at what citizens are doing in terms of social media in regards to government, the statistics are quite different. Now, granted, these data was collected in 2009, so it's quite outdated. It has probably changed. But as of April 2010, 46% of citizens felt that it was a good thing for governments to try to reach out to them via social media, while 40% of people agree it was a waste of money. So again, governments are kind of torn because on one hand, they want to engage, but at the same time, they're also getting a message, or they actually don't know what the message is from the citizen. And are wondering whether they are going to see us wasting money, which in the United States is always a death toll for a politician. But what we do know is that there are some actual benefits. Obviously, if you post a video on YouTube, you do not have to provide the bandwidth to stream it. You also have the new searching behaviors of people, which allows them to reach out to you in different ways. And you can also express your content in different ways. You no longer have to go, to your IT guy who knows HTML and can put it on your website. You can just do it yourself. It allows you to communicate with citizens in a more direct way. Also, the communities are already created. That was already mentioned. The people are already there, right? You're at the mall, as one of the people that we have talked to said. People don't have to find you at the store anymore. You're at the mall. They know where you are, and they can get to you. And again, one of the most important benefits that people have also mentioned is that it provides additional channel to get people to go to your website. Facebook and Twitter aren't equipped to be able to, for government, express policies and very difficult topics that require a lot of text. That is your website. Facebook isn't going to replace the website, but Facebook does allow you to let people know about new policies or new services, and then drive them to your website, which is ultimately the goal. We also ask about barriers, and there were many, and I don't know if I'm going to read them all, but some of them were, governance of social media engagement. People are very afraid that if they jump on the bandwagon, their employees are going to go rogue on them and start posting things that they shouldn't. It was a very big concern of many, many government agencies. Also the legal ramifications. Again, Theresa mentioned the problem with the terms and conditions. In the United States, that was a huge problem. It is still a problem, but it is getting slowly better. They were also nervous about, the negative perception. If I do engage with my citizens and they post negative comments on my official Facebook page, what is it gonna do? Is it gonna make me look bad? And how do I deal with that? Security was, of course, quite a bit of a concern. Lack of organizational resources. Theresa said facetiously, social media is free. It is not free. It is not free. There is a cost associated with it. Depending on the tool. For instance, if you want to do YouTube videos, you have to have the camera. You have to know how to edit videos. You have to have staff that is comfortable in front of a camera. And it also takes time. It's not extremely burdensome, but it's not free either, and you should recognize that as well. They were also afraid of information overload. There is so much information out there. If I throw more stuff out there, are they just going to shut me down completely and not listen to me at all? And the other thing that they were worried about quite a bit is, how do I convince my boss to do this? It's not easy. They are very worried. They're usually elected, so they have a bigger stake in terms of presenting their agencies in a certain light. So those were the concerns that we have heard about. Now, I wanted to do a small group discussion, but I don't think I'm going to have time, so I'm just going to ask you as a group these two questions. In your countries, I would love to hear what are the benefits that you think your government agencies see from using social media, and also what are the barriers? What are those? What are the benefits and what are the challenges that your governments in your countries are facing? Anybody? Luis?
Well, I was actually in a workshop where there were many people from government in Mexico. And they were looking, even though you just said that social media is not free, if you have zero infrastructure, then it is much more attractive.
Yes.
Because they saw a free infrastructure where they could do some work. And I think that the most common barrier that they were sharing were that they were a little scared, in part about this, how to manage this bad feedback or negative feedback, how to defriend these citizens that are not good to them, and also
that they met at a party.
Yes, and also overload, because many of them have memories about email. So they said, well, email was very good, but then one day I had 126 emails in my inbox asking me things. So they were concerned about how to manage that workload.
Yep.
Okay, once again, I'm Sergio Campo, and I do not represent the Ministry of Justice of Finland, but I do work for them. I'm a free agent because I'm also a researcher at the Södertörn University in Sweden. So I skip around, and I'm an outsider. I'm not from Finland, nor from Sweden. In any case, Finland had parliamentary elections just a couple of months ago, in the spring. And for that purpose, the unit where I work or I am engaged with has had in charge all the dissemination of information for the elections and so on and so forth. And I come up with the idea that whether we're going to have Facebook or not, because I've been following the processes in the United States and elsewhere, so I'm very interested to see whether that is possible to try out in Finland. And then someone asked me then, well, what does that imply? So I said, well, we open up a thing and say, hi, come and vote this and this date, and we're very encourage the people to say this. Oh, just a second. Is that about information? So the information department has to look at this, and because it goes like this and like that. Or, but I said, well, yeah, but maybe a video. But that's IT. Or do we have to talk to the people from IT? So now what I'm saying is that there were two things. Yes, there is a lot of interest, and at the end of the day, they did it not under the ideas that I had. Well, okay, so someone took over, and they are more knowledgeable than myself. But although the interest there is, the problem of a place like the Ministry of Justice is information, how accurate the information comes out. The official working for Facebook or whatever social media you have has to be very clear as to what he or she is allowed to say and in what way, because it is in the representation of the ministry. And I insist, I'm not the ministry, I'm not from the ministry. And the second thing is that by doing that, when you have a very heavy bureaucratic apparatus, then you cannot engage in the same way as social media does, fast and quick. You deliver very slowly. And although you could believe that you could throw away everything else, just say, come and vote, that implies a series of other things, because there is a problem of communication, etc. So there you have a real problem to engage with social media, although there is a lot of interest. And I'm working with a very dynamic group. Yeah, so yeah, I'm not criticizing them, I'm just saying that it's a very, very difficult engagement.
Thank you.
I think Ibrahim had
gentleman there.
Thank you very much. I'm Ibrahim from United Arab Emirates. I think on the benefit side, it's almost the same in other countries, especially considering the high penetration of social media and cell phones in UAE. But on the barrier sides, or the obstacles, I guess there are organizational and then cultural obstacles. On the organizational side, I think the biggest challenge is how to adjust the way government agencies used to communicate in a vertical, rigid way to fit the horizontal way of communication in social media. How to be able to understand the pattern of discussion, analyze them in social media, and then get a useful feedback, and then get this feedback into the processes of service design and decision making within the government. And then there is a cultural barrier, especially at the top level management within the government agencies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All the comments that we have heard, have to do a lot of management of social media engagement, and we actually have a day-long class on this at CTG, so I can present all of it. But the content issues and the citizen engagement, what do you do with it once you get the comments back? Those are very common, and while we always advise them to make a plan, it sometimes can be difficult. Yes? I'm sorry, did you have a question? Oh, okay.
Yes, one of the first sort of, I'm not sure if it's even a government level, but one of the state level large campaigns using the social media was when President Obama was elected for the president, and there was quite extensive aftermath done on different surveys and different papers presented how it was used and what was trusted and what was not. And if you look at those tables, then you see that one of the less trusted media actually on those campaigns were blogs and the social media as such. That was of course several years ago. And being worked for one of the largest IT companies as well, at some point of my life, I know that the social media is very often both on the governmental and on the corporate level is basically used as an advertising tool, imagining that nobody will understand and this guy is getting paid for blogging. So my question is, has it changed in past couple of years, or if we'll actually talk about the social media on the governmental level, are we talking about public servants doing it, or are we talking about government agencies doing it?
Right. That is a very good question. And the way I always talk about it is we don't do campaigning. CDG is not about talking to politicians and helping them, create their social media strategy for a campaign. We are talking about government agencies using social media. So some of the concerns about propaganda are not necessarily mute, but a little less, because obviously if I read a blog of a politician that I strongly distrust, I'm simply not going to trust the information no matter what form it is in. I mean, it's not just blogs, it's also printed media. So I think what we studied was just government using social media for information and service purposes.
Jana, can I jump into this?
Yes, absolutely.
No, I think this is one of the problems, that we have in this conversation still, is that, when we talk about the Obama campaign, when Obama was campaigning, it wasn't government.
Right.
It was the Democratic Party that was using social media to get Obama into office. And so it wasn't government use. And this is where it gets confounded, I think, in a lot of our conversations, is we have to understand, are we talking about government individuals who are seeking government office and therefore using the platform to put forward a position? Are we thinking of the platform as a way to bring communities together to inform government? Are we thinking about using the platform, as Jana says, as a way for government to engage citizens either for feedback or actually as a service delivery interaction? And so I think in the early days of the web and e-government, we hadn't sort of created all the nuances of use so that we could plan around them, as Jana talks. But I think we're starting to see more clearly the nuances and to be able to talk about the differences in terms of how we use social media. And I think that's a really good one. So now President Obama, as the president, is using social media to campaign, but he's using it. He doesn't call it campaigning, but we all know it is, right? So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out because I think this is one of the things that we have to be really careful about when we're talking about these things.
Last comment, yes.
May I add another clarification? The fact that because it comes up when Obama now is president and so on, we have to split also government from state.
Absolutely.
Okay? Because the government is those people who have been elected to be the head of the state or whatever you have, and then the state is the apparatus that stays there and offers services and so on and so forth. And most likely, they have their officials who are paid to stay there, and they have a career within the state apparatus. But Obama is president and politician,
yes.
and that's here very, very important. Right. All these distinctions, yes. and deliveries of services and so on.
And if you actually look at President Obama's use of social media, he does have a dual track. He has one track for him as a campaigner, as a politician, and then a second track as an executive chief of the nation. So there is a duality to it because of legal issues. Okay, so moving on to why do governments need a social media policy? As I said, a lot of government agencies are trying to jump into using social media, and it is scary for them. It is scary because they are afraid what their employees are going to do. They're afraid what their bosses are going to think of them. They are afraid that they're going to screw up, and they are afraid that they are going to lose legitimacy with their public. And social media policy is one way to communicate to the employees on how to not let any of this happen, or inform them about how to use it properly if using it as a delivery channel. Now, at this entire conference, people have been using the phrase governments use social media. And in the United States, it's government agencies use social media. Well, government and government agency does not use social media. There is no such thing as, the Department of State, going online and ticking, right? It's the employees that use social media on behalf of their agencies. And as we are doing our research, we realized that there was a very important distinction, especially in regards to when you start writing policies. So what we distinguished was 3 different types of use of social media by government employees while at work. So there is the agency use, and that is the Department of State Twitter account or Department of State Facebook account. And there is a specific group of employees who are responsible for posting information onto the official agency account on behalf of the agency, not representing themselves. Then you also have the professional use of social media while at work. Somebody in previous sessions has mentioned GovLoop, which is basically a Facebook for government employees in the United States. And that is a very popular platform for government employees to find information about how other people are doing things that they are interested in. So we have, for instance, employees using GovLoop or other social media asking questions about acquisitions of IT. How do you get around a problem? And they're not asking, the person next door, but they're asking person in California, and they are sitting in Boston, for instance. So that is the professional use. That is improving the professional to make him do his job better. And then we also, of course, have the personal use, which is, me going on Facebook during my lunch break, hopefully my lunch break, always my lunch break.
That's because I'm in the room.
Yes. And updating my profile with information about what my kids did at a soccer game or something. The distinctions are important because the boundaries are very, very blurry. And they are blurry because you can simultaneously engage in professional and personal use as well. The person who goes onto GovLoop, for instance, can share information about acquisition, but he can also share his favorite recipe. So you have this collusion of professional and personal uses, which when you talk to the human resource management people, they're like pulling their hair out because they don't know how to control it anymore. And you also have linked up personal and professional identities. I only have one Facebook page. And if I identify myself as an employee of the Department of State and I say something bad about, I don't know, let's pick Estonia since we are here. If I say something bad about Estonia, it might have repercussions for my professional life because I'm no longer just representing myself on my personal account, but I'm also identifying myself as a professional that is connected with Department of State. And the same goes with the permanency of social media content. It never quite goes away. You can find information from 5 years ago, and when you're trying to hire a new professional, you want to check back his records to make sure that there is no embarrassing video of him doing anything illegal, for instance. Why that's important is because it makes monitoring employee use more difficult. You can no longer block CNN and know that nobody's going to go on CNN. If you block Facebook, nobody will go on Facebook, but that also limits your agency's ability to go on Facebook and engage with citizens. It also is more difficult in coordinating agency message. Suddenly you have a room full of people who know how to use Facebook. It is not that difficult. I cannot do websites, but I can do Facebook very easily. And you also have legal issues, at least in the United States, connected to employees' rights to privacy and, and free speech. Can you really monitor his personal Facebook account and punish him for saying something when he is really on his personal time? So as we are talking about this, and as we analyze 26 documents that we have collected in the span of about 6 months from October of 2009 through March of 2010, we started to realize that we identified 8 essential elements that you should think about when you are jumping in as a government agency, and that should be in your policy, not necessarily all of them, but you should definitely think about including majority of them, if not all. The 8 essential elements, it's employee access, how you're going to control your employees and access to social media. How are you going to manage your account management? How are you going to make sure that there is nobody going to be posting anything embarrassing? You know, how do you make sure that your accounts are protected and nobody has passwords that they shouldn't have? Then you also have the acceptable use, and you know that is the classical, you know, my government or my employee is gonna go on Facebook and spend 4 hours chatting with his girlfriend type of a deal. How do you make sure that your employees don't waste time doing Facebook? Employee conduct. How do you make sure that your employees, when they are representing your agency on an official social media account, don't do anything embarrassing? How do you make sure that they know what to do and what not to do? Content, you know, that was already brought up. How do you manage your content? What are going to be the channels through which your employees can post things on an official social media account of an agency? Security and legal issues are self-explanatory. And then also citizen conduct. How are you going to manage your citizens, right? I know it's supposed to be all free and open, but who are we kidding? We have to manage citizens as well, because as a government agency, we cannot afford to have inappropriate content on our official sites. So access. Again, access policy delineates who and under what conditions can access social media tools from a government-owned network device. In our report, we don't necessarily tell you what you should do, because we believe it's different for every agency depending on your context. You know, for a large agency, you might allow everybody to go on Facebook. For a smaller agency, you know, that means that your people might be wasting time, so you might actually restrict the access. In general, what we have seen in the United States is that one agency we spoke to had open access without restrictions. Everybody else limited it. What some of them created was a process for how to get access. So you, as an employee, could present a business case to your manager that says, you know, I, for my professional reasons, I need to be able to access Twitter or Facebook, and they could get access that way. Other agencies based their access on selecting sites and tools. For instance, one agency thought that YouTube was a very valuable source of information for their employees, so they let everybody use YouTube, but not all, not the other tools. Account management. Account management means the creation, maintenance, and deletion of social media accounts. We had a little bit of an embarrassment of our newly elected New York governor, who created a Twitter account and they posted the link on the website. What they didn't know, that the account was not active. One of our graduate students, not of CTG, but at UAlbany, noticed that and created an account on his behalf and started posting things as the governor of New York. And he did it for a couple days, for like 5 days. And, you know, fortunately, he wasn't too facetious. But eventually, people caught on. There was not an official, you know, he was posting information that governor probably wouldn't. And it was on the front page of New York Times. And you don't want that to happen to your agency. So usually, what we say is you should have a protocol for opening an account. You should have a process by which a program within your agency can come to you and say, we think that having a Facebook or YouTube channel would be very beneficial, and this is my business case. You know, this is the reason why I think we should have it, and there should be an approval process that they can go through. You should also provide guidance on maintenance of logon information of existing account and employees with access. You know, this is the typical, if one of your employees has access and has the logon information and then you fire him, well, if he still maintains that information, he can do some real damage to your social media account. So you want to know who has access to your accounts, and so when they leave, you can change that and protect the integrity of your account. Also, account closing guidance. You know, we see a lot of social media tools or social media sites of governments that haven't been used for months. And, you know, we say if you haven't used it for 4 months or less or more, maybe just close it and delete it, because it doesn't really provide any value. And in some ways, it actually makes you look bad out there. And the same is password guidance. You know, make sure that passwords are protected, that you know who has them, and then if they leave, all passwords are changed. Acceptable use policies. Again, these are, at least in the United States context, that is very straightforward. Acceptable use policies are in place for use of internet most of the time, of computers, telephones, cars. So those are not necessarily new. But what we have seen is, with the increasing popularity of the tools for professional reasons, acceptable use policies don't address that. They say you cannot use it for personal reasons. But there is really no allowance for the professional use. And that is something that some government agencies are slowly starting to get around and are starting to recognize that they do have to take that into account as well. Employee conduct. Employee conduct addresses what is right and what is wrong in terms of employees' behavior when engaging with social media tools or on social media platforms as an employee of a particular agency. Again, some of these rules are in existence, right? Your employees should know that they shouldn't swear at citizens. Pretty basic. They shouldn't insult them. They shouldn't do anything illegal. But again, it always is good to remind them that those same things apply to social media, because social media has this informal, personal feel to it. And employees need to be reminded that if you are representing an agency, you're no longer being representing yourself. You're now speaking on behalf of agency. As a government agency, you need to maintain some decorum that doesn't include swear words, for instance. Again, this is where we encounter the blurry line between personal and professional. To what extent has a government agency right to punish an employee who is posting something inappropriate on their personal Facebook and their personal time? For instance, recently we had a huge union protest in the state of Wisconsin for many reasons. And the Wisconsin paper posted something along the lines that the Madison police is going to clear out the protesters from the Capitol. And the Indiana Deputy Attorney General posted, use live ammunition, meaning shoot them. I assume it was a joke. However, it was extremely inappropriate to do it, especially since he was identifiable and people knew his position in government. He lost his job as a result of that. The one thing that we have seen a lot of governments do is that they mandate their employees use disclaimers on their personal postings. Things such as, as the gentleman said from Finland, I do not represent the ministry. I'm talking as an individual. And that is one way to kind of get around, the sticky, professional, personal use and the legal issues connected with that. Content. Content is probably the biggest area that needs to be managed. And what we have seen is different strategies for how government agencies manage their content. Majority of agencies use centralized process for employee posting. In other words, it's usually the public information officer who is tasked with maintaining a social media account, meaning that he is the one who is going to post everything. Now, that goes against the spirit of social media. Social media should be social. You should have an informal, immediate relationship with your citizens. But I think that is still, a cultural struggle for a lot of governments because they're not used to that and they are, quite frankly, afraid of that. Content policy doesn't have to set a detailed protocol for the whole agency. For instance, if we are speaking about a United States federal agency, that has, some of them have 20 huge departments. But what you should do is mandate that each program that wants to create a social media account should have some type of a content policy that they should follow. The other thing that we have seen in terms of producing content, for instance, NASA has an incredible social media platform. I mean, they have astronauts, twittering from space and taking pictures from space, and it's really amazing. So some agencies are much more willing to let their employees engage directly. Nobody is checking the astronauts' Twitter. They're just posting it directly. It will take too long to go back and forth. And we have seen it, for instance, with the Environmental Protection Agency as well. Some agencies and some of their cultures are much more willing to experiment. We are not going to see it with Department of Defense for obvious reasons. It really depends on your context, and you should not underestimate the context of your agency because that's what's going to drive what is okay for you to do. Security policy outlines security procedures employees have to follow when using social media tools. Just like email, just like internet, there are things on social media that are dangerous for your infrastructure. At this day and age, if you get an email that proclaims that you have just won $500 million, dollars from, I don't know, Australia, you're probably not going to click on the link. I mean, there are some people who do, but most people know that it's probably not a good idea to open that link because it's going to infect your computer. It's a different story when you get a message from your mother saying, hey, I just saw something very cool, why don't you click on it? And because in social media you have this assumption of trust, right? It's coming from your mother, it's coming from your good friend. You might be more inclined to let your guard down and click on things that you probably shouldn't. When we talk to government, to the IT people in government agencies, they really said it's behavioral more than technical. The technical issues are the same. Your spamware, your malware protection, all that stuff. It's the education of your employees and their behaviors, making them aware of what can happen if you are not careful. That matters in terms of security. We also haven't really seen many policies that are very concrete with security protections, simply because social media changes so fast. So you see new threats arising almost every day. But there are some basic rules that they have been using. Legal issues. Now, again, we only studied the United States context, so legal issues in your country might be completely different. But it is something that people see as a huge barrier to their usage of social media. And at least in the United States, the problem is that the policy environment has not really caught up with the technology, right? Technology, and I think it was Taiwu who has used this in his slide, technology is spinning 10,000 miles an hour. Policies are spinning 10 miles an hour. So you have a huge disconnect with policies and the technology. And that sometimes creates legal barriers. For instance, in the United States, some of the legal barriers are terms of service, as I have mentioned before, records management. Do I have to keep everything in social media? In the United States, every agency has to keep every piece of information they produce or get from citizens. Does social media fall under that? And if so, how do I keep it? How do I capture it? Freedom of speech, it's the same, employees talking on their personal accounts and you want to monitor it. And citizen privacy. We had one agency who wanted to contact people with disabilities through Facebook, except they didn't get permission to do so. So when they tapped somebody, they managed to tap somebody with the same name but without disability. The person who was disabled later found out about it and felt that his privacy was invaded because somebody else, who he doesn't know, but still somebody else with his name, found out that somebody else with the same name has disability. And that was a huge concern for that agency, and it was shut down immediately. Lastly, citizen engagement. And I changed the name of it just an hour ago because I realized it's no longer just citizen conduct, it is citizen engagement. Citizen engagement refers to setting protocols for the appropriate conduct of citizens on an official agency social media site and how will inappropriate conduct be handled, as well as providing directions on who is responsible for monitoring and reviewing citizen input. A lot of the people that we have spoken to felt very worried that if they open up their social media accounts for citizens' comments, they are going to get inappropriate behavior. People attacking each other, people attacking each other for reasons such as racial issues or sexual issues. And they realized that in order for them to maintain the integrity of their social media engagement, they cannot have something like that happening. So what some of them have created is rules of conduct, and you can see them usually posted right on the front page, for instance, of a blog or a Facebook page. And the rules of conduct explain to the citizen what type of comment is going to be accepted and what kind of comment is going to be deleted. Again, those are very, very normal rules of conduct. Don't promote illegal activity. Don't engage in hate speech. Do not insult anybody because of their race, nationality, or accents, for that matter. And what we have also seen is that some government agencies, what they're doing is when they review the comment, in the spirit of openness, if they see that, for instance, somebody slipped an F word in the middle, which is a swear word, they send them an email back and say, we would really like to post your comment, but you have to remove, a certain portion of it, otherwise we cannot post it anymore. So that way they kind of get around the censorship issue, which is also a big concern of citizens. And also, if you want engagement, you need to manage the engagement. You cannot just let a comment sit there for 20 days and not answer it. So you also have to start creating rules that mandate who is going to be responsible for monitoring the site, who is going to be responsible for reviewing citizen input and responding to their concerns, for instance. And we have seen various strategies for doing so. Some agency posted in their rules that they're only reviewing the site 8 to 5, Mondays through Friday. If I get your comment after that, I'm going to post it the next day. And what that means is that the citizen is not expecting, a post to come on at 2 a.m. Because he knows and he has been informed that it's not going to happen until 8 a.m. when I get to work. Creating a policy, getting started. What we have realized a lot of times when we talk to government agencies is that, one of those, my boss saw that the other city had Facebook, so he wants me to have Facebook too. And that is the wrong way to go around it. You have to have an objective for using social media, because your objective is going to drive what you're going to do on it, and also creating the policy. Social media, as I believe you have mentioned already, is a very multifunctional thing. When we first started interviewing an agency in New York State and about their policy, or about engagement on social media, they said, well, the HR person sent me to the PI person, which is the public information, and the public information officer said, that's not me, that's the IT people. And the IT people sent me to the legal department. So you have this, confusion in some ways, but also realization that if you want to have an effective policy, you need to bring in a team that includes all these facets, because they're going to be all involved in making sure that engagement is appropriate. You should also look at your existing policies, because a lot of your policies are going to cover social media tools or some of the aspects of social media tools. And also, as the president of Estonia said in his opening talk, doing things online mandates that we look at our existing policies and laws and procedures and see if they are consistent or inconsistent with social media engagement. For instance, what we have often seen is that the existing policy mandates that all public information is going to be reviewed by the public information officer, who is then going to send it, to the head of the department, who is then going to send it to somebody else, and then eventually it will trickle back down to you and you can release it. But that is no longer feasible in social media world. You need to react much quickly. So you need to look at your policies or at your existing procedures and see to what extent they aligned with social media. This is our report. It's on our website. It's a 10-page report, very easy to read. It includes examples from different guidelines and social media policies that we have reviewed, and it also includes links to them. Like I said, it's freely downloadable. Yes, go ahead.
Actually, this is I know is that some other countries have started to use this document to develop their own policies. And if it does turn out that you do that, we would love to hear about it, because we can add your links to the models, to the examples, so that they're not just looking at U.S. examples, which are, maybe interesting, but maybe not very useful or relevant. So if others use this to develop their own policies or have feedback on it, let us know and we can add it.
Mm-hmm. I was going to show you an example of how DOT has used it, but I'm just going to go through that. And then I was also going to talk about some of the strategies for thinking about your plan. But we are running out of time, so I'm going to just open it to questions and discussion.
Do you have the manual in other languages as well?
No, it is only in English right now. Could translate into Czech, but I'm not so sure it's a good idea, considering my Czech is going down.
We'd love to, maybe, any ideas for how we can, in fact, get it translated would be great. It's, as Jana said, it's not that long, but...
It's not that long, no. It's on purpose. Yes. If you just Google it, the title, you don't have to, it comes up right away.
Excuse me, I'm from the government of Syria. Relating to this policy issue, do you consider that it's possible for a government to develop a policy based on social media that is related to private companies, related to other government rules and regulations? The case of Syria is one, and you can consider others. Can we build our policy based on a products or a software that, or services, whatever platform, that we don't know when it will be allowed to be used, when it will be rejected, when they will be changed their rule, when they will close it, when they will open it, and whether it is required to develop something that is with multiple options, because generally you are using social networks, then at other times you say Facebook. You consider social network is Facebook, is Twitter, is whatever. But I'm not sure to what extent a government can rely 100% on a platform that has different regulations and the rule, and that is changing. The internet, for instance, as a platform, nobody can stop it in general. But when it comes to specific application, we witnessed a lot of cases where content is removed, content is replaced, accounts is closed, open, based on unclear policy. So would you think that a government have further explore the possibilities that is there to use social networks than to look only to this private or software, private companies related platform?
If I understand correctly, are you asking me whether you think it's a good idea that governments should create their own platforms for social media?
This is your solution, one solution to it. I think it should be integrated, local and international.
Yes.
I agree that it should be integrated with the international network, but any policy should have its local presence as well, or regional, unless you have an international governance to this platform.
Right. I think what you're talking about is more about strategy for engagement versus a policy, at least in my context of a policy. I believe that a policy should be developed. You can have an enterprise level policy, but the policy should basically mandate the individual departments to create their own policy that is more suited to their context. So for instance, the example I said, EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, or NASA for that matter, cannot have the same policy as Department of Defense because their contexts are so different. United States doesn't have an enterprise social media policy for the federal government, but many state governments have created such policy. Again, I believe that the context of the agency should mandate the policies, and I think if you create an enterprise-wide policy, you have to take that into account.
Just commenting on the question, I think it's a very important question. We had an experience of developing social media policy guidelines for the government of United Arab Emirates, and we relied a lot on this report. It was an excellent starting point for us throughout the process. But one issue led to his question that the policy should be technology neutral. This is not help anyone on how to use Facebook or Twitter.
Yes.
because these tools change very often.
Yes.
Rather, this is a policy on a higher level, provide guidelines for different government agencies on how to manage their social media presence.
Yes. Absolutely, I totally agree. You know, we actually differentiate in the policy between guidelines, which is how to use Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, and then a policy which should be tool neutral because the tools change so quickly. For instance, you know, MySpace, you know, who uses MySpace these days? And that used to be the popular one. You know, now it's Facebook, but you know, who knows what it's going to be tomorrow? So I totally agree that, you know, your guidelines can be tool specific, and that is how you log on and how to create a good engagement. But your policy should be tool neutral, absolutely.
I will take the opportunity to say thank you for you and CTG
Oh.
for the help.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay, we are at 4 o'clock. Are there any other questions? Okay, one more question.
I know that this is the social media policy domain in which we were discussing all these things. But a blue moon concept come to me that in my organization as an educational institution with 10,000 students and the external domain, I can also have a social media policy for my own college as a principal of the college. Is it possible?
Absolutely. Go ahead, yes.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on this one because before I became an academic, I was an IT manager at a university, right? And acceptable use policies, we've had acceptable use policies as long as I worked in this context from the 80s, right? Where it was very important for individual students and faculty and staff who were granted accounts agreed to use those accounts in an appropriate way. So many of the concepts that underlie the social media policy guidance come from any one of you who might have read, you know, appropriate system management guidance from, you know, when we had mainframes. The principles are still there, and this is why it's so important to look back 20 years. We have to have guidance. This doesn't say that we're going to control what people say,
right,
but we would like to have them say it in an appropriate way, given that it's a public comment. So I think that's the difference, right? We absolutely have to have acceptable use policies in place in our institutions of higher ed, because it's something we've done when we were on mainframes and deck writers and when we punched cards, right? Not that I ever did that, right? But I think this is just part of taking what we know and what we've had to create in terms of management frameworks and carrying them forward into a new technology space.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thanks.